What's good, everybody out there on YouTube? This is your man Shadic Stick, bringing you back another video, especially with this video. I don't know if you guys like it or not yet. I'm recording this the same day as the Kingdom Hearts video, but it's a video I've been wanting to do for a little bit, especially since I just got this controller. But I'm going to be reviewing the Horipad for the Nintendo Switch. Now, I was actually very surprised by this thing. It's one of those controllers where I feel like it was going in the right direction, and it's very usable. I think many people might actually like it, but is it the controller for me per se? I'd say no and yes, and I'm gonna tell you why in a bit. So let's begin.
Here I go. All right, bring it on.
Alright guys, we have the Horipad here. It is $30 now. This is less than half of the price of the Pro controller, which we all know is $70, which I think is wild. I think it should be like $60, $50. I understand there's stuff in there like NFC and HD Rumble, but Jesus Christ, $70. At least it's not like getting two Joy-Cons. That's $80, and I think getting this is, you know, in a way better if you want a traditional controller. Now I do have to say this has no rumble, it has no motion controls or gyroscope controls. It is wired and it has no NFC capability, so it is a very bare bones controller, but that doesn't stop it from doing what it does. The buttons actually feel pretty decent. They don't feel the best. I'm not gonna sit here and say, oh, this is something like the Xbox One controller, because these, oh, you hear that? But it's still pretty decent to use. It's a little bit on the soft side, which I don't really prefer. I prefer, you know, somewhat clicky buttons, but still it does get the job done, and it's actually pretty decent. You know, if once you play with it for a bit, you don't even notice it, and that's if you have a preference. The bumpers actually feel really nice, and the triggers for, you know, Nintendo triggers, because they don't have the full analog pull triggers, it pretty decent. Thumbstick clicks are, you know, they're whatever, they're thumbstick clicks, and I don't have a preference for that. The plus minus home and all that stuff is there accordingly. And one of the coolest features of this controller in terms of buttons is actually the turbo button. Now this was a staple back in like the GameCube, in between the N64 and GameCube era. You don't see a lot of controllers with it now, but it can come in handy depending on what game you're playing. I mean, I don't really use it. I feel like I'm cheating in a way if I use it, but it's pretty cool. I used it in Mighty Gunvolt Burst, and holy mother of Christ was I shooting super fast. Like, I would never be able to do that physically, be able to press the buttons that fast. So it's pretty cool seeing it be used there. I do have to say this though, the analog sticks, while I like them in the sense of the way they feel nice to use, they have a little longer travel distance than what I like. Say for instance, the Xbox One has this nice travel distance right here, and it's a little bit longer than the Xbox Ones, which is fine with me, but you know, the Xbox One is like really the limit in terms of controller travel distance on the analog sticks that I like. So it's one of those things where it's a personal preference. Again, if you like the longer travel distance, you'll like this controller. On top of that, it's one of those things, even if you like shorter travel distances, that you'll get used to. And I think this controller actually works really well in shooters despite that. I used it a lot in Fortnite, and I used it in Splatoon 2, and it was actually really fun to use. I definitely prefer using this controller in Fortnite than I do the Joy-Cons. And that's not the poop on the Joy-Cons, it's just the way how close the analog sticks are to the buttons on the Joy-Con, and how small the analog stick actually is. This feels like a big upgrade in terms of that right analog stick from the Joy-Con. So if you're coming from the Joy-Cons, these analog sticks are going to help you a lot more in games where the camera movement, such as shooters, is more important. On top of that, it's about the size of an Xbox One controller. Here's the controller. Here's an Xbox One controller. I mean, like, I'm sorry the cable's in the way, but they're roughly about the same size, but it doesn't have that heft the Xbox One controller does, especially when the Xbox One controller has like a battery pack or batteries in it. It feels more along the weight of a PS3 controller, maybe a little bit heavier or lighter, I don't know, depending on which PS3 controller you have, but it's not anything that that will kill it for you. It doesn't feel cheap. It's light, but it doesn't feel cheap. You know what I mean? It's at that threshold of the PS3 controller. This controller is really at one of those controllers that is, in some aspects, it just feels really good. The buttons feel good, all that stuff. But in some instances, it feels almost cheap. Like the weight, the plastic actually feels pretty decent. But just, you know, you can tell this is a $30 controller, but it gets the job done, and it does a little bit more than getting the job done. But I tested it with a few games. I'll show the gameplay right here, and it really worked well. I don't know, you tell me. You know, other pluses about this controller, it can be used on PC, and it has this exchangeable D-pad thing. This is not necessarily a plus, because I don't like the way they did the D-pad on this controller. Alright, so if you've used the Joy-Cons, you know the Joy-Cons have buttons instead of a traditional D-pad, but we all know why, and that's because the Joy-Cons are made to be used as separate controllers and the same controller. So having a D-pad there, having buttons instead of a traditional D-pad there makes sense, and it actually works really well. And this controller decided to go the Joy-Con route in having buttons, which I don't mind, because in terms of the buttons, it feels better. Than I'd rather do this than use a Sony D-pad. But the issue here is they're in this little divot. If you didn't notice, you know, you notice, and it looks kind of weird. It's in this little divot, and you're like, why does it have that divot? And that's because of this. On the back of the controller, which this comes on the face of the controller, but they have this little area where you can have this little D-pad mechanism thing, and it's kind of like a Sega D-pad thing in a way. I don't know, but once you put it on, it gives away. There's no clickiness here. It feels like I'm just pressing against plastic. It doesn't feel good at all to the hand. Some people might be able to use this. If you use the 360D, like, I'd argue this is almost as bad as the 360D pad. Like, it's that bad. It's just mushy, and it just rotates. It's not a good experience to use that on there. So I'd advise you use it just like this, because this can take some you know, getting used to, but it feels decent. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel bad. With this little thing on there, it's terrible. It would suffice for something that doesn't really utilize the D-pad, and you don't want that long traveling distance between, I guess, the analog stick and the D-pad. But if you're not playing games like that and it relies on the D-pad, take this off, put it on the back, and it's fine. You know what I mean? It's just one of those things where I feel like they should have just raised up the buttons. It would have been fine, and it would have worked really well. But overall, would I recommend you buy this controller? If you have a Pro controller already, don't go out and get this controller. The reason I say that is mostly because unless you have a lot of people who come over all the time, it's not really worth getting this controller over the Pro controller. But if you do not have a Pro controller, it's actually a pretty good deal. I don't have one, but in the games where I feel like I need one, I can use it, which is really just like shooters and stuff like Fortnite and maybe Doom if I were to have that. But the most important question I think you guys are looking for is, do it play Smash though? And while I can say it's usable in Smash, it's not my preferred controller. It might be for someone else. It's not a bad controller to use for Smash. Don't really need to use the D-pad in Smash for things other than taunt. If you use it for other actions, don't use this controller. But it works relatively, I guess, okay for Smash for me. It feels like I'm using like a 360 controller for Smash, which that wasn't actually necessarily bad. I hated the 360 controller, but it worked, you know, decently well for playing Super Smash Brothers if you played it on emulator or anything like that. But it works decently well. So if you want to pick one of these up for Smash, if you don't like the GameCube controller, go ahead and do that. Like I said, again, it works decently well for Smash. But if you have the Horipad, tell me how you feel about it down in that comment section below. Tell me whether you want to buy it or not, or tell me how you feel about it. This has been your man Shadic. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. The link to buy this controller will be down in the description, and we're out of here. Peace. Kiss, kiss.